Hello everyone. So I have just read the briefing of Luke Skywalker in the Shadows of Mindor. I know I said don't expect these reviews for a long time, but I couldn't resist anymore, especially since I only just finished Gambler's World. So this car picks up a character from the Mace Windu book Shatterpoint, and I've not read that book. So I'm unfamiliar with this character, but I have heard that Shatterpoint isn't essential reading for this, just has connections to it. But Lord Skepton is waiting to be summoned before Luke, and we're told that he's not, of all people, we're told that he's not only a Jedi but the son of Anakin, and he's meeting him face to face. And we're told a little bit about Gepton. He wonders if he's gained too much weight in 3 months. He thinks he can't have because he's struggling to unloosen his collar. And we're told that he wasn't much in favour in the dress uniforms. And he left that on his own world decades before, at the beginning of the Clone Wars. And we're told that Republic intelligence had been a largely covert surface and had had no use for uniforms, and he left after it became Imperial intelligence, and his investigation of the so-called Jedi Rebellion has uncovered certain things that the Imperial executive prefer to conceal, and for a number of years, we were told that he had been forced to make a living as a freelance broker of information, while trying his best to avoid any official Imperial attention. We're told that he eventually offered his services to the rebellion, and although he isn't too big on politics, he recognises that the government they had would afford him a great deal more opportunity in the way of freedom to make his own way in his own way, and it says which was another way of saying to live and work in the lucrative shadows outside official scrutiny. And we're told that this makes his current situation all the more ironic, and he sighs and thinks that nothing works out how they wish, and he says, doesn't mean one can turn it to one's advantage. And he sighs again, and he goes to ring the bell, but before he can, the door slides open, and Luke calls him in. He's a bit shocked about Luke. He sounds a lot older than he expected, and when he sees his face eventually, he looks a lot older than he expected. He's a bit, and he's a bit annoyed at what Luke is wearing, because it's a tight-fitting civilian outfit, and he thinks that if he'd known this, he would have worn something more comfortable, like a loose-fitting blazer. Or blazer, that's what it says, just a blazer. And Luke lifts his head, and Gepton's a bit shocked at how old he looks, despite only being 24. And Luke says that he knows a little about Gepton, and that he was a military governor and director of planetary intelligence for the CIS during the Clone Wars. Then he was a Republic spy, and after that he made his living tracking targets for bounty hunters, and now he's a JS investigator, I think it's judical something. And he says, through all of this there's been a running theme: you have talent. And Gepton says, do I? And he keeps interrupting him while Luke is explaining what he has done. And Luke says that he seems pretty good at finding the truth, and Gepton relaxes and says, "Oh well, thank you for." And Luke continues saying that making money off it, and Gepton clears his throat but has something to say. And this is when Gepton sees his face, and we're told that Luke doesn't look like he's been sleeping for a few days now, and he looks very tired, and Luke asks for what Gepton knows about him, and he encourages Gepton to start speaking, and he says, "Oh well, you know the usual: Tatooine, Yavin, Endor, Bakura, Death Star 1 and 2, and Gepton shuts up when he realises he's babbling, And Skywalker nods and says the usual stories, the stories, the press releases, and he says that the problems of those aren't the problem with those releases and stories is that they aren't really about Luke at all, and are more about what everybody wants him to be. And Gepton says he's afraid that he doesn't understand, and he senses that he's been manoeuvred onto a dangerous ground. Luke nods slowly with a tired sign that says that it's because he know, and he says that in case you don't, that's because if you don't know, that less than a month ago I murdered about 50,000 innocent beings. And Gepton is able to figure out what he's talking about, Mindor. And Skywalker closes his eyes and says that, yeah, Mindor, I say about 50,000 because I don't know the real number. Nobody does. The records were destroyed along with the system. And Gepton says that from what he's heard about Mindor, his actions would hardly constitute murder. And Skywalker says that, again, more stories. Gepton starts to say something about about something he's heard, and he picks up on what Luke's meaning, and he says, and asks what Luke wants him to do, and Luke says that he wants him to investigate because he's an investigator, and Gepton asks what, and Luke says to investigate Mindor and him, and Gepton's a bit, and Gepton starts thinking of these several ways he can profit off of this, and he asks as to how his name came up, and Skywalker says that he was recommended by an old friend of Gepton's, Nick. And Gepton says, Nick? I don't know any. And Skywalker says, he said to give this to you. And he gives him a hook-shaped, curved, metallic-looking object, and he warns Gepton that it's sharp. And then Gepton touches the object gently, and that's when he gets all images flashing in his mind of Nick Rostu. Again, that's the character from Shatterpoints that a narrator appears in Coruscant Nights. And he breathes and says that he hasn't thought of Nick in years, decades, and he thought he was dead. And Skywalker says that he probably is. And again, Gepton doesn't quite understand, but he understands a little, and he knows that this object was from his and Nick's homeworld. We're told it's a brass fine thorn, and Skywalker says so. He was right about that anyway. He said that you can read objects that you can touch them and sense things about their owners. And Gepton thinks, why trouble denying it? And he says it's a minor talent but useful in an intelligence analyst, and Luke adds, or in an investigator. And Gepton asks what else Nick told him about him. And Luke says, he said you're vicious, venal and corrupt, and that you don't have a shred of decency, and about as much human feeling as a glacier lizard. Gepton nodded abstractedly. That does sound like Rostu. He also said that you've got plenty of guts, that you're the smartest guy he ever met, and that once you get started on something you never ever quit. You don't like Jedi, and you don't much care who rules the galaxy, as long as you can make a decent living, all of which makes you exactly the man for this job. Gepton asks what the job is, and Luke explains that he wants him to investigate Mindor, and get the facts, talk to the people who survived Mindor, and make sense of them and make a case. And Gepton asks what sort of case, and Luke says war crimes, and he lists a couple of things, such as crimes against civilization, dereliction of duty, desertion, that kind of thing, and he says anything you can find out. And Gepton asks about who he wants them charged, and Luke says, I thought it was obvious, it's me. And Gepton just says he'll do it. And that's where we end this the briefing, which again does kind of lead into the end of this story, which as far as I'm aware, that from what, as far as I'm aware, it is implied at the very end of the book that the whole telling of this was just a that the whole telling of this book was that the rest of this book is a retelling of the events. So, and that with this opening and having that context, that makes sense. I'm not personally not massive when it comes to Star Wars stories, whether it's retconned or not. In this case, it's not a retcon, but still, I'm not too big on many Star Wars stories. Say that other stories didn't actually happen, or there it's a fiction, it's a retelling or something like that. It's one thing I don't really like much about with I think it's like the Young Jedi Prince, or the Adventures of the Jedi Prince or something like that books, because they have the Prophets of the Dark Side. In this books I've also had my eyes on, because of the Prophets of the Dark Side, but apparently it was retcon that they are just stories that Leia told her children. Oh, I don't like that. I don't like that at all. It kind of makes books feel more irrelevant, and it just doesn't sit well with me. And I'm not too big of like the whole fake Cades and stuff in there. But anyway, we're talking about Mindor, not the Prophets of the Dark Side. But anyway, again, this was an interesting opening, and one thing I really did like about this opening was Luke. A lot. It feels very Luke for him to want to charge himself for his own actions. It feels very Luke to do that. He's the guy that tries to do as much justice as possible. He's the guy that tries to do the best for people. And you can understand why he wants to charge himself with this, Especially now that, the main war is over against the Empire, he can kind of afford to sit back a bit more and be in this sort of situation. So it's a very Luke thing for him to want to charge himself with crimes. But aside from that, there's not really a whole lot to say with this briefing. I keep wanting to say chapter, but it's technically briefing, because that's what it refers to itself as. I do think the interaction between Luke and Gepton was a bit funny, when Gepton's constantly clearing his throat, pausing, having ums and ahs in there, and Luke is, again, it's described as being quite tired, but you can kind of tell he's a bit nonchalant, a bit casual in the way he's talking. You can kind of tell that from the interaction they've got going there, and to an extent it's funny, but also the topic we're talking about kind of reduces that humour, and I think that's a good balance. Like the whole interaction where Luke is talking about Gepton's past as an investigator, and how Gepton keeps interfering and say, well, actually, and then Luke interrupts him and continues. It was quite funny. But I also do quite enjoy that this book got into this. I keep saying book. It was quite interesting that this also got into the fact of playing upon that the galaxy doesn't really know what Luke is, what he's like, who he is. They have this image of what Luke should be, and I think that's a very interesting thing to play off of. Which is, I think that's again a very interesting idea that I don't think we'll get explored much. I don't think it's going to get explored much at all, but it's definitely something that does make you think. It makes you think, and it's a very interesting perspective, because it's, for a lot of people, this is for people that are often in the press and stuff. We see them as who we want them to be, rather than who they are, and I think that's a very interesting. I think that's an interesting and something that's an interesting thing, and I think something that, something to be considerate about. That just because you think of someone one way doesn't necessarily mean they are that. And I think that's a very interesting thing to bring up. Of course, I don't think it's going to get much explained. Again, this is about Mindor, not the aftermath of Mindor. So I doubt we're going to get into much detail about it. But I do think it was an interesting thing to bring up. And it's definitely something that I would like to see. It's definitely a story I would like to see at some point, So, yeah, that would be an interesting story to see about, how people's lives are influenced by what people think they are. That's a very interesting story idea that would be nice to see get played upon. That would be a good story to get played upon. So yeah, there's probably a story like that out there. Talking on a more general scope, there's probably a story like that out there. So yeah, if there was any problems I have with this chapter, it's not so much the I keep saying chapter. If there was any problems I have with the briefing, it's not so much the briefing itself, but more so the page numbering. Because the first page for the briefing has no numbering. Then the rest of it goes into Roman numerals, which look, I'm fine with no Roman numerals from about 1 to 6. 1 to 4 I start to struggle, because I always wonder, mate, which one is which one's 4 and 6. I kind of know which one 4 and 6 is. I say I kind of know, I do know, but as soon as the numbering comes on the second page of the briefing, it's I think it's X is usually 9, isn't it? So, or is it 10? So the numbering actually comes on page either 13 or 14. I assume 14, because it's XIV, and then it goes to X5 to XV, and then it goes to XVI, and XVII, and then XVIII. So yeah, that is maybe one problem, because it's you'll sometimes lose track of where you are in the book. And you'll also sometimes skip a page, so that's the entire point of numbering pages, and it does feel a bit odd for the numbering to be like that. To not even be there on the first page and only be there on the second page. At that point, it's like, why even have the numbering at all? But yeah, it was good. I did quite enjoy this briefing, and I think it again is an interesting look into Luke's character. I think this says more about Luke than Gepton. It feels very Luke for him to want to trial himself for something he did. It feels very Luke to do that, and I think that's quite interesting. And it will be interesting to see whether that gets played upon at the very end of the story or not. I don't know. But we'll see. We'll see. I think that brings an end to this review though. So thank you so much for watching, and goodbye. Hello everyone, you have no idea how happy I am. I've been trying to read this chapter literally all day, and I finally got round to it. So, I've just read chapter 1. I want to say Last of the Jedi. It's because I've been reading that for 3 months, well technically 4, if you want to get into specifics, but anyway. I've just read chapter 1 of Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor. And I've also read what I guess would be the equivalent of the Star Wars movie title call. So I'll start with the title call and get into the chapter, because they lead into one another. So the title call tells us that it's 6 months after the destruction of the second Death Star, and Skywalker, Luke, and the Rebel Alliance and the victorious Rebel Alliance are still struggling against the surviving Imperial forces, who still remain determined to crush the galaxy and all that is good in it. Now we're told that black armoured stormtroopers under the command of the mysterious warlord, Lord Shadowspawn, are raising the New Republic, and they're taking up piracy, pillage and destruction in the wake of the Empire's collapse. And they're attacking at will, and we're told they've shaken the galactic confidence of the New Republic's ability to maintain order and stability and security. And we're told that deep along in the Corellian Run, the Alliance's premier fighter squadron, Rogue Squadron, has set a trap for Shadowspawn's forces. And we're told that the Corellian Queen is a legend and the greatest luxury liner to ever fly the space race, and we're told how it's pretty much only can be accessed by the most elite of the galaxy. As it says toward the end, who better to terrorise than the elite of the elites, the powers among the powerful, the greatest of the great. We're told that a cocktail would cost a starship, a meal would cost the starship, a berth for the berth of that starship, and the ports in which it docks, and also pay for the berth of and also pay for the factory it had been built in. So it's a very expensive liner that only a few people can get, that where their wealth transcends description. And it makes it pretty much the perfect target to terrorise. It's, as it says, who better to terrorise than the elite of the elites, the powers among the powerful, the greatest of the great. And we're told so when some unscrupulous routing clerk in the vast mid-reaches of the Nebula Line Corporation quietly offers for sale to select parties from Kindlabria, Kindlabethia, and to Nar Shaddaa. So a hint of the Corellian Queen's upcoming cruise, of the routes of it. It attracts some considerable attention. And we're told there were some facts that were concealed. The first fact is that the clerk was actually a New Republic agent, part of the intelligence service of the New Republic. And the second is that the Corellian Queen wasn't even running this season. And we're told that there has been a disposable shell built to conceal a substantial fraction of a starfighter wing in its place, and we're told it was customary in such operations such as and it was led. We're told it's here it says the second pertinent fact was that the Corellian Queen was not cruising at all that season, having been replaced by a breakaway disposable shell built to conceal a substantial fraction of starfighter wing, led by, as was customary in such operations, the crack pilots of Rogue Squadron. And we're told it's precisely at that moment it's precisely the moment that R4G7 screams the proximity alarm through Derek Hobby Clivian's X-Wing. And the X-Wing sensors panel, and that alarms come through these X-Wing sensors panel, and his HUD lights up with image codes for the TIE Defenders. Begins to suspect that Wedge Antilides' plan, Commander Wedge Antilles, how his brilliant plan and brilliant ambush have maybe not been so brilliant after all. So not even a little, and he says it. And he says in no uncertain, as it says, he said in no uncertain terms, stripped of its blistering profanity. His comment was, "Wedge, this plan was stupid. You hear me? Stupid, stupid, stupid. Yow!" So the yow comes from being blasted, from one of his wings being blasted, by one of the TIE Defenders, and he fights to gain control, and he sees the pair of defenders blossom into flame, and he's still spinning out of control because the shockwave pushes him just as he's gained control. This defender formation streaking towards him head on again, and his comlink crackles as Wedge flashes past him, and he flashes close enough that he can see the grin on Wedge's face. And Wedge says, "That stupid plan, Sir Lieutenant." And there's funny interactions here between everyone, between Wedge, Wes Jansen, and of course Hobby. Hobby says, "I suppose you think that's funny." "Well, if he doesn't," put in Hobby's wingman, "I sure do. When I want your opinion, Jansen, I'll dust your ship and scan for it in the wreckage." He's starting to feel sick with all, and Hobby's feeling sick with all the spinning, and he's trying to get back control again. And he's able to fire. He's able to position it just right at some incoming defenders. Where he's able to open fire from his 3 surviving cannons, and he only does one with the cannons, but he also let out a proximity fuse flechette torpedoes. They triggered at the same time, and they flared in diverging arcs to intercept the enemy fighters. And they explode the fighters in spectacular explosions, and only 3 of the defenders remain. And he says, "Now that was satisfying. Eyeball so full." And he's still trying to stabilise the X-Wing. And Jansen says, "Better watch it, RB, keep that up, and somebody might start to think you can fly that thing." And they have a very funny continue to have a very funny conversation. Hobby is not too much when it comes to humour, while Jansen and Wedge, they're very much jokers here. At least Jansen's very much a joker, and Hobby's not often amused and gets more annoyed by his jokes. And he sees Jansen fire out some as it says, 2 brilliant blue stars leap from Jansen's torpedo tubes and streak onto the oncoming ties. And Hobby asks if they were flechette torpedoes, and he says, "Sure, what else?" And Hobby says, "Have you noticed I'm currently having just a little trouble manoeuvring?" And Jansen asks what he means, and he sees him flailing out of control towards the defenders, and toward the torpedoes targets, and he goes, "Oh, sorry." And the flechette torpedoes, we're told, will carry this. The thing is, sometimes this will get into into a lot of specifics. And we're told that the torpedoes carries by Rogue Squadron are built specifically for them. Were designed built specifically for this operation. There's one primary purpose: to take out TIE defenders. We're told a bit about how effective TIE defenders are, and how they don't have a specific kind of shield, and so they rely on their hull to absorb the impact. A particle shield, that's what it was. And these torpedoes have little jagged edges and break off into shrapnel when they explode, which pretty much shreds the defenders like they're a cheese grater. Now it's on the 4 fighters on the oncoming defender formation hit. We're told the four medial fighters of the oncoming defender formation hit the flechette clouds and just shredded. The lateral wingers managed to bank off an instant before they would have been overtaken by 2 sequential detonations, as the explosions of one defender's power core triggered the other 3's cores in an eye blink. So the unfortunate Lieutenant Clavinian was now tumbling directly towards a miniature plasma nebula that blazed with enough radiation to cook him like a bantha steak on an obsidian fried fry rock at double noon on Tatooine. If there's anything about this book so far, it really gets into long-winded conversation. It really gets into long-winded explanations that really could be explained a little bit better. But Jansen warns Hobby that he's not going to make it, and Hobby keeps on ignoring him. And he's interrupted by a final flip of his X-Wing, which brings his nose into line of the leading edge of the spherical debris. And It says, "An hobby Gravinian acknowledged master of both profanity and obscenity, human and otherwise, not to mention casual vulgarities from a dozen species and hundreds of star systems found that he had nothing to say except or nuts." He stands the X-Wing on its tail. It says Sublights blasting for a tangent, but he has learned long ago that all the rogues, that out of all the rogues, he was the one who should know better than to trust his luck, and he reaches for the eject trigger, and he notices the trigger isn't there, nor is his left hand, and it's been taken out by some of the taken out by some of the debris. And he's not it's not really in shock or pain. He's just annoyed because it was already a mechanical hand, and we learn he's already got a mechanical leg as well. Now, I'm not sure if Hobby's ever been in anything else, but anyway. And we're told the more concerning thing is the continuing streak of the atmosphere, because as we're told, he's discovered that it was coming from his environment suit's nitroxy generator, whatever that's meant to be. And he thinks, "Oh, this sucks," and we're told he survived everything in a galactic civil war. He was about to be killed by a minor equipment malfunction. And he corrects his previous thoughts, thinking this really sucks. And he doesn't bother to say it out loud because there's not enough air to carry this out anyway. And he pushes his left wrist into the hole of the canopy. That's about fist sized. And his suit auto-seal plasters itself to the jagged edges of it. But we're told the nitroxy generator doesn't seem modified. In fact, it's starting to feel like he had unshielded a fusion core strapped into his. He had an unshielded fusion core strapped to his spine. And he thinks, "Oh yeah, the other hole." And he puts his foot into the hole. His left foot, and he has to kind of twist around into an uncomfortable position to do it. And his boot gets sucked out, and he's unsure as to whether his foot is being sucked out either, because again he has a mechanical leg, and you can't really feel it. But his suit again is able to auto seal itself, and the nitroxy unit calms down and fills the space with breathable atmosphere that smells only faintly of scorched air. And he begins to think that he might live through this after all. And we're told that no, the only problem was that he had de-harnessed, and that he was stretching sideways in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position. And we're told the Swifts left him even unable to turn his head enough to see where he was going. And he asks for his droid to take him back to the PRP. And but he's able to look over to R4, and you see he's completely wrecked. Half of his dome is sparking, is gone, and he's just sparking, and has a halo of sporadic electrical charge from the dome. And he sighs and says into his comm that he's had an ejection failure, the astromech's damaged, and he's awaiting manual pickup. And someone, I assume Jansen, says, "Little busy right now, Hobby. We'll get you after we dust these ties." And he says, "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere except, that away. Slowly, real slowly." And we're told he's spent waiting the whole battle, waiting for help, and he fantasises about who will help him. He wants anyone but Jansen to help him. He continues this play sort of like a meditation, and it says in the kind of the way Luke would talk about. It says he continues this play as a sort of meditation, kind of the way Luke would talk about this stuff. He closed his eyes and visualised Wedge himself showing up to tow his X-Wing back to the jump point. After a while, he found this image unconvincing. Somehow he was never that lucky. So he cycled through other rogues, and when those began to bore him, he decided it'd be Luke himself, or Leia, or say Winissa Starflare. And we're told that who always managed to look absolutely stellar as a strong, independent damsel sometimes in distress. And we're told because, you know, as long as he was, in those pre-war Imperial holodramas, and we're told that, and it says, because, you know, as long as he was imagining something that was never going to happen, you might as well make it entertaining. And he winds up falling asleep with a smile on his face. And he wakes back up to a brilliant flash that stabs his eyelids. And it wakes him up. And he thinks that's whatever exploded next to him is about to snuff him out. And as it turns out, he's able to painfully, with a painful twist of his body, he's able to see Wes Jansen cruising alongside only meters away. And you can see the handheld imager, which is pretty much just a camera. And Jansen has pressed it against his cockpit canopy, and he's taken a few pictures. And Hobby closes his eyes again. He says he would prefer, and he thinks he would prefer the explosion. And they have another interaction. Just had to get a few shots. Jansen's scream was positively wicked. He looked like some sort of weird cross between a starfighter pilot and a Petravian gunplucker. Hobby shook his head exhaustedly. Dealing with Jansen's pathetic excuse for a sense of humour always made him tired. Wes, I don't even know what that is. Sure you do, Hobby. A starfighter pilot is a guy who flies the next wing without getting blown up. Check the basic dictionary. Though I can understand how you'd get confused. No, I mean, Hobby bit his lip hard enough that he tasted blood. Wes? Yeah, buddy? Have I told you today how much I really, really hate you? Oh, sure, your lips say, I hate you, but your eyes say, that someday I'll murder you in your sleep. Jansen chuckled. More or less. And, Hobby asks if it's all over. And Jansen says that it says that this parties and most of them got away. And Hobby asks how many they lost. And Jansen explains that he only lost 8 and 11. But Avon and Faley's ejected clean, and it's nothing that a couple of weeks in the back of the tank can't cure. And he says, and then there's my Petravian gunplucker wingman. And he Hobby says that he's the wingman, and maybe he should say wingnut. And he says he gets his wedges happy anyway, as everything's proceeding according to plan. And Jansen says he hates when he says that, and Hobby asks how come. And this is probably, I don't know, I've never heard this expression used before, but Jansen says, don't know, it just gives me the whinging jimmies. I've never heard that expression before, whinging jimmies. If anyone knows what that means, please comment below. I've never heard whinging jimmies before. I think it's whinging. But you know, I've tried to Google it, didn't really get anything useful. It's what's whinging jimmies? And he says to let him. And Jansen continues saying, "You'll get the tow cable attached, and you may as well sleep because it's a long cruise to the PRP." And Nobby says that it suits him just fine. He closes his eyes again, and he says that he has a dream he really wants to get back to. And we cut over to Lando Calrissian, who's congratulating Wedge. And we're told he's the commander of special operations for the New Republic. And he asks if there was no casualties. And over the hologram, Wedge says there's nothing serious. And Lieutenant Clivian needs another left hand. And Lando smiles and asks how much does that make in total. And Wedge says that he's lost count. And he asks how is it going on his end. Lando says that he's scored and less scored, and it seems the marauders are in the task pan system. And we're told that Wedge's brilliant plan has worked. And that it had become brilliant just because out of necessity, because the usual method of sending, of locating a hidden marauder base, which was subjecting and captured pilots to a maneuverable probe, had turned out to be much more difficult than anyone could have anticipated, because Shadow Spawn seems determined to maintain his privacy. and we're told that through dozens of raids over nearly 2 months, many deep inside Republic, many of Shadow Spawn's forces are deep inside Republic territory and costing thousands of civilians' lives, but not one of Shadow Spawn's marauders was ever taken alive. And we're told that this was more than a simple refusal to surrender. We were told that the marauders had shown a distressing tendency, when they found themselves in imminent danger, to shout out the words with something to the effect of, "Shadow Spawn! For Shadow Spawn and the Empire! Forward to the Restoration!" And they blow themselves up. And we're told that forensic engineers who have examined the wreckage of the TIE Defenders hypothesised that the starfighters were equipped with some unexplained type of dead man interlock, which would destroy the ship and obliterate the pilot, even if the pilot's just merely lost consciousness. And then we're told about Wedge's plan, and it gets really convoluted, but all you really need to know is that the proton torpedoes, the ones that break out into shrapnel, the ones they used in that battle held transponders, which is pretty much just a tracking device. And they kind of stuck onto the TIE Defenders, but they're very special transponders, because they're the only ones really of their kind. They're only used in Rogue Squadron, and they're pretty much inactive until they're turned on by a certain and they gave off no signal of their own, which makes them effectively just undetectable. And they're completely inactive until activated by a very specific subspace signal, and then they echo in a very specific way. And we're told they're the only kind of transponders of this type in the galaxy, and they're loaded into Rogue Squadron's torpedo tubes. And we're told that drifting at the ambush point in deep space and on the Corellian Run, here it says, and since the only transponders of this very specific type in the entire galaxy were loaded in Rogue Squadron's torpedo tubes, drifting at the ambush point in deep space along the Corellian Run, and lodged in various parts of the armoured hulls of a certain group of TIE Defenders, locating the system of which said defenders have fled was actually not complicated at all. And Wedge seems to have a vaguely puzzled look. And he says, "Taspen sounds familiar, but he can't place it." And Lando explains it's in the inner rim off the Hedinium way. And Wedge says that would be the Lesko part. And Lando explains that there's no straight lanes in or out. And he explains that most of the legs that run through the systems, he says that most of the legs run through systems still housed by the Empire. And Wedge says almost makes it wish for one of Palpatine's old planet killers. And Lando's smile has faded, and he says almost. He doesn't sound like he's joking when he says that the Empire had a weapons facility on Taspen too, and that's where they tested various designs of gravity well projectors. And it clicks for Wedge, and he goes, "That's it." And he goes, "The Big Crush," which I actually kind of want to Google. What's the Big Crush? Is it just something made up for Mindor? Yeah, just made up for Mindor. Okay. Wedge says that's it, the Big Crush, and Lando nods the Big Crush, and Wedge says that he heard there was nothing left at Taspen but an asteroid field like the graveyard of Alderaan. And Lando says that there's an inner planet, Taspen 1, which is a minor resort world called Mindor. And it's not well known, but he says it's really beautiful, and his parents had a summer house there when he was a kid. And Wedge asks if there was any progress on who Shadow Spawn is, and Lando says they've only been managed to determine that no official in the Empire was ever registered by that name, and he says it's clearly an assumed identity. And Wedge says that guy's got to be some kind of nut job, And Lando says that he doubts it, and he says his choice of base is positively inspired. He says that the debris of the Big Crush hasn't actually had time to settle into an orbit yet. And Reg says so, like the graveyards of Alderaan. And Lando says it's a lot worse than Alderaan. And it appears Reg gives the low whistle, though. You know, the hollow projector noise field screens it out. And he says it sounds ugly and asks how they're supposed to get at them. And Lando says that they're not supposed to get at them, and this is exactly the kind of situation for which they developed the Rapid Response Task Force. And Reg gives a slow understanding nod and says, "Hit 'em with our big stick then. Snap 'em good." I'm not going to say that. And it says snap 'em good, and it says run and run. I'm not going to say the other two words that follow that. And Lando says it's the best shot they've got, and Wedge says that Lando's probably right, because, and he usually is, and it'll just sting to not be there. And Lando says right enough, but they have other problems, and the RRTF is in very capable hands. And Wedge says got that right, and he says speaking of those capable hands, to pass along his regards to Luke. And Lando says, "I will do that, Wedge, I will indeed." And that's where we end the chapter. I found this quite funny. I think the interactions between Hobby and Jansen were very funny. You know, I was often laughing at it. I was finding their interactions incredibly funny. You know, Jansen, it's because of how Hobby reacts, well, Derek Cliviny, whatever you want to call him. It's because of how he reacts to Jansen, you know. They're clearly, Jansen and Reg, you know, they're clearly just having fun, having a laugh. And you've got Hobby who's taking this really seriously, and he's not too impressed. Which makes for a really funny, dynamic and combination to read. And it's done in such a way where it almost feels a bit like some of the interactions between characters in Thomas the Tank Engine. You know, has that kind of feel to it. You sometimes have some of the characters insulting another character who takes it really seriously, and they're not too impressed by it, but the other engines are having a laugh at it. You know, it very much reminded me of Thomas in that sense. It's a very, very funny interaction. I do think some of the explanations about how some of the stuff works did get quite a bit technical, and got a bit too much into detail, I think, and it really could have just been brought down to the basics. You know, it didn't need to get into massive amounts of detail about what everything was, because I was struggling to follow the really detailed bits, because really the only bit, and especially because it was referring to different bits that really weren't relevant to the situation, and how the bits that were, and it got to the bits that were relevant to the situation, and that's thread. You know, that's the bits that matters, and you could kind of understand it, but because it's all like the ships and stuff, and of course because it's fictional, it gets a bit with all the technicalities, and I think, you know, it could have worked with being a bit less technical. You know, I think out of all the technicalities, they probably, as a whole in this chapter, probably take about about a page total of this chapter, and this chapter is about 11-12 pages, so of course that's in total, not as in individual scenes. They take up quite a few pages, of course, but in total, you know, they take up pretty much about a page, because if you're talking about all the technicalities in there, pardon me. Again, nice to see Lando in here. I wasn't expecting to see Lando. Or Reg, actually. I wasn't expecting to see either of them. again, I know who Shadow Spawn is, and I think a lot of people who read this at the time knew who Shadow Spawn was, because I'm fairly sure they announced who Shadow Spawn was before the book came out. You know, it was I think they confirmed that it was Chronal before the book came out. Or Black Hole, or Peric, or whatever you want to call him, you know. It was confirmed that it was Shadow Spawn before the book came out, I think. So I think a lot of people knew who Shadow Spawn was going into this. So I think some of that mystery is probably taken away. But at the same time, you know, it's kind of made obvious that it is Shadow Spawn by the involvement of black armoured stormtroopers, and it's, who else is that going to be? Black armoured stormtroopers are they're literally associated with Black Hole, the Shadow Troopers, or Black Hole Troopers. You know, the Shadow Troopers are literally the forces of Agent Black Hole. Or Director Black Hole, whatever you want to call him. He has so many names. He has so many names and titles. You know, he has way too many, really. It's always confusing as how are you meant to refer to him as. But yeah, I did quite enjoy this chapter. I thought it was funny. It had good serious moments. It had a lot of great stuff in this chapter, and I think it's a really solid start to the book. Of course, it's not perfect. And I think one problem I have with this book, you know, it's the first page of each chapter doesn't have a number. For some reason, it has no number. And it really is like, well, what if I go from the first page of the chapter to the fourth page of it, you know, or third, you know, it's without realising, I think that's maybe something that's a bit problematic. So you kind of have to rub the pages to make sure, every time you flip the page, just to make sure that you haven't gone to the wrong page, especially because of how thick this book is. How many pages there are in this book, you know. It's a much smaller book than the Last of the Jedi ones, and there's a lot more pages to this than Last of the Jedi. It's probably, again, this is about 3 times the length of the average Last of the Jedi book. Probably more accurate to say 2 and a bit times the length of the Last of the Jedi books. So yeah. Of the Last of the Jedi books, you know, not as a whole, just individual, you know, they're about 130 pages or so for the most part, with a couple reaching 40, 50 and 60. So yeah, I really enjoyed this chapter. I think it was a very funny chapter. I think it was a very serious chapter. I think it can get a bit convoluted at times with all the technical explanations, and it's just been... All we really need to know is the specifics of the circumstances. We don't need to know every single detail. We just need to know the specifics needed to know what's going on. You know, you don't need to tell us that the TIE Defenders have shields as strong as capital ships. You know, when that's not even relevant to what's going on. We just need to know that they're particle shields, that they don't have particle shields, and that the other shields wouldn't allow for other things to go through, and that's really all we really need to know. So they didn't really need to go into sort of details about the Defenders shielding, you know. And I think those details sometimes, it can make it a bit unnecessarily complicated and convoluted. You know, I think sometimes keeping it simple and to the point is sometimes the best way to go. And I think that's probably, if there's anything that holds this chapter down, it is the technical explanations. But for the rest of it, it was a very fun chapter. It was fun, it was funny, it was clever. It was very clever of how they track the ships down. And I like that we're getting also straight into it. You know, I like that we're not having a couple chapters to slowly build up to Mindor. I like that we're getting just straight into it. And especially because, you know, there's only 18 chapters, you know, you don't really want to spend too many chapters wanting to get to Mindor, only to get there in like the very last bit of the story, and then you know, you can't waste the whole book then, if you only get there in like the last couple chapters and have the battle in the last couple chapters. So yeah. So I think this was quite a good chapter. I'm looking forward to the others, but they're definitely going to be quite. They're definitely going to be about. I did a bit of googling. This book has about 300 pages. It's a little bit over 300 pages, but it's about 300. They come out, so it means it's going to be roughly about 15, 16 pages a chapter. So yeah. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello everyone. So I've just read chapter 2 of Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor. Again, this was quite a lengthy chapter. Now, all the chapters are going to be lengthy, at least for me. So Luke is with other commanders and captains and admirals in the command suite of the Justice. And the Taspen system is has been schematicized and is on a hollow representation. And the schematicized hollow representation of the Taspen system filled the entire command suite of the Justice with ghostly translucent clouds of blue that ever so slowly twisted and spun, merged and parted, moving into and through each other. High in the centre of the room hung a dark disc, about the size of the last joint of a human man's thumb. This represented Taspen itself. And we're told the planet Mindor is a brilliant pinpoint that hangs in this point of the simulation. He's about a metre in front of the commanding general's nose, and by the description we know it's Luke. It said that most of his attention is consumed by the glum contemplation, by the fact that he's the youngest in the room by at least a decade. And again, we're told who this is through his description, which again matches kind of the description we got at the start of the book and, you know, Luke's description. We're told that he's the newest as well as the youngest general in the Combined Defence Forces of the New Republic, popularly known as the NRDF. And we're told that he doesn't look much like a general or soldier. And the smooth curves on his face make him look much younger than his 24 standard years, and his sandy hair streaks blonde by dozens of different stars is still more shaggier than military strict. And he's instead of a general's battle dress, he wears a close-fitting flight suit like starfighter pilot he has recently been, and only the rank plaque on his chest marks him as a general. And only the remote shuttered reserve behind his clear blue eyes show the price he had paid to earn this rank. And we're told he's even adding to his unconventional appearances his lightsaber, which haven't been worn by generals since the end of the Clone Wars. And we're told 7 of his 12 captains had their own commands before the Battle of Yavin, and 3 of them have been commanding ships all the way back in the Clone Wars before Luke was even born. And Admiral Kalbak of the Fleet Commander is a distal pod cousin of Admiral Akbar, or some such, and was at least 60-something by now. And then there's a character with a really wacky name, Churk. I think it's Churk. I never get that right. I think it's apostrophe, you know, the floating comma. I can never remember what that's called. Then it's CHTTRK. C''CHTTRK. I don't know how you're meant to pronounce that. And she doesn't even know how old she is, because her people, an insectoid species called the T''KKRPKS, and the Tuckerpix. They hadn't started calculating time in standard years until the Great Reconstellation about 100 years ago. By that point, Teacher Turk, she has long been an adult and a hereditary officer in the planet's defence forces. And we're told that it's quite normal for Luke to be the youngest around, and it didn't bother him to be the new general at all. He barely even notices. But what is bothering him is all these seasoned veterans who are among the best tactical engagement commanders the New Republic's had ever had, even though, you know, it's fairly new at this point. Are just so deferential to Luke and just presume him to be right on everything. And resume that, and you know, they accept his wisdom and commands without question. And it's because he's a Jedi, and they all assume that he knows what he's actually doing, even, and he thinks if only it were true. And we're told right now, all he really knew was that he should have never let Hand talk him into this. And we're told that he's in the minute that he chose the place where he was most comfortable, and the people who was most comfortable talking to with his troubles, which is in the Millennium Falcon with Han, Leia, and Chewbacca. And Han had said to him, with an arm draped around his shoulders, and saying, this was saying the general business, there was nothing to it. And if he could put it off, then Luke wouldn't have any problems at all. Luke asks why he'd resigned. Then, if it was so easy, and Han said, "Better things to do, buddy. The princess is pretty important, but not so important the New Republic can afford having full general play chauffeur and bodyguard." This is the thing about this book. It's good so far, but the problem is it goes on bits of tangents, in sense of it starts on one thing and adds a whole bunch of information and winds up rolling back to where it started and continuing from there, and it really winds up with oddly phrased things, or it winds up being convoluted and oddly phrased. And it could have just been simplified. And I think this is what the thing with this line here: the princess is pretty important, but not so important the New Republic can afford having a full general play chauffeur and bodyguard. And it's a bit confusing because it's Han talking about the New Republic here, or Leia, because the way he's talking makes it sound like it's the New Republic, but also Leia. It's confusing. This line really should have been it's one of those things where it could have been so much better explained. And I think this is probably the problem with this book. It gets a bit convoluted in what it's trying to tell you sometimes. And again, this really... And I was complaining last chapter about how it got a bit too technical, and that kind of becomes a bit of a problem later on, but we'll get to that. And then Leia just sniffs, "Bodyguard? If you're my bodyguard, how come I have to keep rescuing you?" And Han just says that's how she proves that she still loves him. And he says to Luke that seriously he can do this, and he's easily almost as smart as him, and he's smarter than Lando. And he says all you've got to do is keep your mouth shut and listen to your officers. Don't let them squabble, and always pretend you know what to do next. Simple. Tell him, Chewie. Chewbacca, reclining with his hands behind his massive head on the couch by the gaming station, hadn't even opened his eyes. "Oh, you're a lot of help. Luke, ignore him anyway. He hates officers. I'm not exactly sure I like being one myself." And we're told the offer of a general's commission had been a complete surprise to Luke, and not a pleasant one at all. Because it was a couple months after the defeat of Rook, and Luke had gone to the Supreme Commander Akbar, requested to be relieved of his duties as a flight officer, and he's explained that for some time he had been feeling that he might be of greater service to the New Republic as a Jedi than a wing commander. It says, Akbar, canny old soldier that he was, counters with an offer of joint command over the New Rapid Response Task Force that was being formed, a fleet-sized flying squad able to bring military power against any point in the galaxy within a couple of days. And he says that if you really wish to serve the New Republic, young Skywalker, this is the job for you. I suspect that your Jedi insight will be of more use in directing tactical operations than in meditation on the ways of the Force. And Luke had no answer for this, and he just said that he needed to think it over, and he thinks that this would probably shape the rest of his life, determine how he would spend the rest of his life, and how he we're told he retreated to the place and the people that he was most comfortable with, the place that felt the most like home, and the people whose company he could still even now really just in where he could just really still even now be himself. And he's stuck trying to explain how he feels to Leia and Han and Chewbacca as they all sit around the passenger compartment of the Millennium Falcon. And Luke says it's just not simple, and he says he's pretty sure nothing is simple anymore. And he says that, do you know they're producing hollow thrillers about me? And not, documentaries about the Death Star assault or anything. They're just making stuff up. And Han says that he's seen them. And he throws over a hollow player. And he says he bought it a couple of months ago, and it gives him something to do while he's waiting for Leia to wrap up negotiations somewhere, or just, finish her hair. No hair jokes, Solo, Leia said. I'm not kidding. And that's very true. It is very true. And Luke picks up the player, and he scrolls over and he thumbs the controls over to the title page and sees Luke Skywalker and the Dragons of Tatooine. And he just says, "Oh, will look at this junk. That's what I mean. It's all just so stupid." And Han says, "But there's no dragons in Tatooine." And Luke says, "Sure there is. There's the great dragons. And they're dangerous enough, especially if they catch you alone. But look at that illustration." And he says, "Not only have I never fought one with my lightsaber from Bantha back, I can flat out guarantee that great dragons do not breathe fire." And Han says to just take it easy because they're for kids. And he says he's got to tell him that some of them are actually pretty good. Which, that's quite true for a lot of kids stuff. Some of them are actually really good. And Leia says, especially the ones about you. And Luke asks if they're putting him on. Which, again, that was something I didn't know until... That was another phrase I didn't know until I googled it, which was... which apparently gets someone interested in something. Introduce someone to something, get them interested in it. Han shrugs and he flushes a little, but it's always only a little because he's constitutionally immune to embarrassment, apparently. And he says, "You're not the only hero of the Republic, And Luke goes, "Han, ask him how much he gets paid," Leia says. "You get paid? Hey, I'm not a Jedi." Han's hands came up as if he was half expecting Luke to throw something. "I worked out a licensing deal with a couple hollow show producers after Yavin. You understand?" "I do." "If he does," Leia said, "maybe he can explain it to me." And Han explains it was Lando's idea, and he's almost sounding defensive. And he says that he got into this deal before he really knew what he was doing, and he says the stuff's pretty bad, but it's harmless. And he lists off some of the tight souls: Han Solo and the Pirates of Kessel, Han Solo and the Lair of the Space Slugs. And Luke says it's not harmless, and says, "Have you seen the one they call Luke Skywalker and the Jedi's Revenge?" And Han says, "But I thought the Jedi don't get into revenge." And Luke says, "They don't, I mean we don't." And he says, "I don't know what I mean." And he says that they have him slaughtering his own father to avenge the death of the Emperor. And it's just so sick. And Han says, "Just take it easy." And he says, "So the right to spice things up a little, what's the harm? A little wham bam just makes you look tough, And Luke says that's not how he wants to look. And Han argues that people need heroes and stories like these are the way heroes become heroes. And Luke argues, "I thought heroes become heroes by doing something heroic." And Han says he knows what it means, and Luke goes, "Yeah, I do." And he says that's part of his whole problem. Everybody's watching him. And it's like they're trying to figure out who he'll turn into and trying to figure out a way to turn a profit on it. And Han says that that's what keeps the galaxy spinning, and Luke says that maybe it does. But he just doesn't want to be a part of it. He wonders if that's what feels so wrong about being a general. And he says it's like he's pushing himself forward, like somehow he talks Akbar into this so he could go on being larger than life. So Luke could go on being larger than life. And Han argues that he is larger than life, and that's what he keeps trying to tell him. And Luke says that being a general being a general, sending other people into places where they have to take someone's life or get killed themselves. Luke shook his head again. Playing the hero when you're in charge just gets a lot of people hurt. Who's playing? Luke, this commission is a wonderful opportunity, and not just for you, Leia put in. Force powers aren't the only kind of power, and there are ways of helping people that are a lot more effective than hitting something with a lightsaber. As a Jedi, you might save the occasional, well, princess in distress or some such, but as a general, you can save thousands of lives, millions. The Defence Force needs you, Luke. And Luke says that he can't beat Leia in an argument, he's no politician, and he asks School and Anchorhead in, have a debate team, and he says, but he's a Jedi, he's the Jedi, and he's becoming a general, and he just doesn't feel right. And Han argues that, says that, when he was working for, he says working for Strike gave him more pressing concerns than following the news, when he was a kid. And he says that, and he says, if you get me, which I have no idea what Shrike is, I assume that's something else about Han's backstory that I don't know. And he says, brings up how Obi-Wan was a general in the Clone Wars, and Luke says that he knows, but he hardly ever talked about it. And Leia says that he was always modest, and Obi-Wan was part of so many of the stories that Bail used to tell her when she was a child, and he was a great hero of the Republic, and that's why Leia turned to Obi-Wan when her cover was blown. Which, that's nice to hear, like, the explanation of in Legends, because I know what because I know, the explanation for Canon's car being swapped to her meeting Obi-Wan and him rescuing her before in the Obi-Wan show, so it makes sense for Leia to contact him again. I know that's kind of what the Obi-Wan show was kind of going for, but it's nice to get the explanation of why she went to Obi-Wan in Legends. Luke says it's just not the way he's always imagined spending his life, and Han says that nobody ends up living their life the way they expect. And Luke goes, no, I can think of this one guy, got his own ship, resigned his commission, got the military off his back, pretty much does whatever he wants to do, mostly just flying around the galaxy with his co-pilots, rescuing princesses and such, accountable to no one but himself. Accountable to no one? Are you kidding me? Han looked appalled. Luke, have you ever met your sister? Luke Skywalker of Tatooine. Let me introduce Princess Leia of the extremely sharp elbow. Leia finished for him, having delivered the sharp elbow in question rather briskly to his short ribs. And Han just says, yeah, okay, peace, sir. And he rubs his side. And he says, all kidding aside, he says for Luke to think about it. And he says that both of them may have even ended up living the life, and says that if they had lived the lives they expected, they might have still been flying at Yavin as Imperial pilots. And Luke looks away. And Han says that sometimes things don't go to plan, he's got to go with the flow. And he says, just in the Force fight, with the Force I brought you this chance if you weren't supposed to take it. And Luke doesn't know, and he brings up how and he says, ask Obi-Wan the next time he appears. And he says that he doesn't come round anymore, it's been weeks since he's seen him, it's like he's drifting away too far to make contact. And Leia says that maybe that means something. Maybe it means something. And Luke gives her a sharp look, and she just says that she knows less about being a Jedi than he does about being a politician. But he says, and she says, but don't you think that your indecision itself signifies that you've been leaning the wrong way? You don't usually just sort of, don't you usually just sort of, no. And Luke says that, yeah, he usually does know. And a saying comes from Yoda comes to his mind. If far from the Force you find yourself, trust you can, that it is not the Force which moved. And Luke says that he supposes he doesn't have to be a courier. And he says, and Han asks if he's in, and Luke nods and says, I guess I am. And Han claps him on the shoulder and says, thanks, buddy, you're the greatest. Thanks for what? He turned his screen all the way on. Akbar swore if I didn't talk you into this, he was going to make me do it. Han Solo and the Rapid Response Task Force just doesn't have the right ring to it, you know. To be fair though, I actually prefer that title over Luke Skywalker and the Rapid Response Task Force. We're back into the we've gone back over to you know, the briefing for the battle, and Commander Thavish, who was explaining everything, and he's the next youngest guy in the room, and he has 5 years of experience on Han, let alone Luke, and he's saying here's Mindor's effective gravitic radius. And he says standard englobement puts our 7s here. And there are 3 pinpoints that form around the equilateral triangle around the planet, which is again the kind of the orbit it makes around its star. And it says roughly parallel to the system's plane of the elliptic. Maybe that's what it means, of the orbit actually. I can't remember which. And the 4th and 5th pinpoints appear above and below the plane, which again I assume is like the planet itself. Again, it's on, or actually maybe it's just on the orbit. It's not necessarily the planet itself. I assume it's a planet, because you know there's not really any point in going from the whole orbit of the planets, really, is there? I don't know. It's all the 5 7s with Strike Force's entire complement of the CC-7700/E interdiction cruisers, well, the CC-7700/E interdiction cruisers, and we're told that each are capable of projecting a simulated gravity well out to several hundred planetary diameters. And we're told when Thavish triggered the representations of the DSs, again, the 7s, that's what it stands for, gravitic influence, the overlapping spheres of effect fields an area roughly 5 light minutes across about 90 million kilometres, in which hyperdrive simply would not function. In other words, they create a gravity well that stops ships from going into hyperspace. You see what I mean by makes it needlessly complicated. It gets into way too much detail, makes it way too convoluted, and it took me a couple minutes to realise what it was even talking about. I couldn't even figure out what it was even referring to with all the epileptic stuff and the planes, and I think that is probably one problem with this book. It enjoys going into detail a bit too much. You know, if it just kept it plain and simple, I think it would be just a bit better. And I mean, you even have Luke a little bit later on saying, no euphemisms, just say it for what it is. Anyway, Thavish continues saying that while the E-Series' weapons upgrades gives the 7 substantial point defense capability, each of them will require a full squadron fighter screen because they just don't have adequate intel on the target's forces. They can find themselves facing anything from just a few dozen to several thousands of those Star Defenders, and the records captured during the Spirana operation indicate that there are still over 10,000 verified production defenders unaccounted for. And he says that plus, of course, we can't say for certain that the remaining Loyalist territories contain no active production facilities, not to mention that he might have interceptors or other non-FTL fighters based in system. Again, needlessly complicated. Again, that's not as complicated. I can kind of see the need for that piece of information actually, but you know, it's just, it's one of those things. It's, you know, if I was to say all of this to my mum, it would just be, I know she would just go, "Hey." Anyway, you have Captain Trent, commander of the Regulator, and he leans in and asks about the capital ships. And Thavish says that Shadow Response forces have never employed capital ships. And Trent says that it doesn't mean he ain't got any. And Thavish says that yes, but there are elements of the system that suggest he'll be facing primarily starfighters, and it's just that there's no way to guess how many. And Teacher Turk, I'm just going to call her Teacher Turk. Citizen clicks a question and her D-Series Protocol droids DP4M. Actually, what is a D-Series Protocol droid? I want to see that, actually. Oh, okay. They're literally just exclusive to Mindor, so there is no image. The droid translates, and the commander respectfully requests to be informed of any good news, and Thavish says that is the good news, and the bad news looks like this. And the translucent clouds drift through the simulation, thickened so they could become actually tangible. Again, as in the hologram, the things it's showing. And he says that these represent their best long-range scans of the debris field from the destruction of Taspan 2. And he says the Big Crush, as it is called, resulted from an accident at an Imperial testing facility for a new type of gravity well projector. And the planet was entirely pulverised and producing debris that ranged from pinhole micrometers to asteroids several kilometres in diameter. And Thavish explains that it occurred only 4 standard years ago, which is just 4 years ago for us. And he explains that the debris hasn't settled yet into stable orbits, and he says that worse, Mindor and Taspan 2 were in conjunction at the time of the Big Crush, and Mindor was the inner planet of the two, so as the chunks flew toward the star, they got caught in Mindor's gravity, and started doing a rough orbit around Mindor, an unstable orbit around it. And Kalbach leans forward, his chin pumps twitching, and he asks if there is no way to plot these orbits, and Thavish explains that even if they could scan them all, which they can't, no computer system could reliably plot their paths. And he says even the word orbit, I'm afraid, suggests a much more settled situation than we'll be facing. And he says that they're constantly interacting with each other in every conceivable way, from gravitic effects to outright collisions. And if he'll direct their attention to these figures, and numbers appear above each of the asteroids, and they keep changing in numbers, and the numbers slowly change, creeping up or down, and the clouds drift together, creeping up or down, when they drift together or overlap zones, producing numbers of their own, higher ones. And Thavish explains these numbers represent our best estimates on the material density of each major debris cloud. Each figure reflects the number of tactically significant objects per cubic kilometre. By tactically significant, we mean large enough to produce substantial damage to a fleet ship in spite of defensive fire and particle shielding. And we saw that Captain Petrel, the grizzled Corellian commander of the wait a minute, swore harshly enough that at least 4 of the other officers flinched, and he says some of those numbers are in the hundreds. And Thavish says, yes sir. And the captains exchange looks that are quite grim. And they think that the prospect of bringing cruisers there, which are themselves a reflectable fraction of a cubic kilometre into that kind of asteroid storm, is bleak. And Thavish says to let him put it another way. And then new figures appear on the clouds, and he says, these new numbers represent the estimated probability of catastrophic impacts, one that results in significant degradation of combat function and crew. And Luke drifts his eyes shut and says that, and asks if that means some people dying, ships crippled or destroyed. And Thavish says yes, sir, and Luke says to just then say that. And when Thavish asks sir, Luke replies that it's an order, Thavish, no euphemisms. We're told that he reflected that 75 years ago he hasn't really known what people dying meant, and the first real taste he had was looking at the chawed corpses of Owen and Baru. And he's learned a lot since then, and not all of it was about being a Jedi. And Thavish asks if it's about being about being a Jedi, and Luke says no, it's a general Skywalker thing. When you talk about someone as a set of degradable capabilities instead of a person, it's too easy to think about him that way too. And Thavish says yes, sir. And he says that they use the 777s as their baseline, and they're roughly median sized for the task force. And he says a 777 at this point, for example, will have 1.85% percentage chance of catastrophic impacts. And Captain Petrel laughs and says that's less than 1 in 50. And he says for a moment you have me scared. And Luke asks what the time frame is. In how long that 1.85% in how long. And Thavish says that percentage is on insertion, that is instantly. And Petrel stops chuckling, and Luke asks after that, and Thavish says, well, the statistical modelling is complex. It's a sliding scale, more or less. Assuming you're not instantly destroyed, we have to calculate let's say an hour. When the numbers came up, the expressions got even more grim. After 1 hour, the probability was running over 20%. So basically, Luke murmured, you're telling us that 1 hour into this operation, when I've lost 2 ships, if the enemy does nothing at all? Oh, the math is a bit more complicated than basically. Thavish nodded apologetically. Basically, yes. And Patchell says it's a graveyard, and it's where the capital ships go to die. And Thavish says that that the Tussman system is almost a perfect starfighter base, because it's easy to avoid the asteroids. In these conditions, they have enough maneuverability to dodge them, but to hold Shadow Spawn there, they'll need the interdictors to stop them from jumping to hyperspace, of course. Otherwise, his entire force can just simply vanish into hyperspace. And the interdictors are so vulnerable that they can't afford to bring them in. And Luke says Lord Shadowspawn, not a stupid man, he knew what he was doing when he picks Mindor. And he looks at the ceiling and takes deep breath, and he wishes mightily that he could steal an hour or two to rest and meditate and gain some insight. But and some of that insight, like a Jedi that he's supposed to have because he's a Jedi, but there just wasn't time, and he wonders if only Ben, Yoda, or his father could phase him right now with a word of wisdom. And it says, but whatever parts of them remained active in the Force apparently had business elsewhere, just as they'd had for months now. We're told there's no insight from the Force, all the insight he has is of his own, and he thinks it had better be enough. And he says that they can't, and Luke says that they can't wait them out, and they can't whittle them down, and they can't even fight a pitched battle, which leaves only one option. Cowback nods and says, overwhelming force, shock and awe. And Thavish tilts his head consideringly. He says it might actually save lives unbalanced, and he says ours at least, maybe even theirs. If we never give them a chance to think they can fight their way out, they might just surrender. And Luke says that saving lives is swell if they can. Winning is more important, and if they let Shadow Spawn's forces escape, then they can scatter and go on the run and break up into small independent units, and Luke says that they all know better than anyone in the galaxy how much damage that kind of decentralized guerrilla insurgency can do, and it's how they brought the Empire down. And he says that this might be their last chance to engage Shadow Spawn force. He looks around the table and he says that everyone of them needs to understand this, that they hold nothing back except a small reserve force to cover their exertion if things go bad, and he says it's full commitment to all or nothing. And the commanders acknowledge it, and Luke says, alright, I want a tactical readiness reports within the hour. We move in 3, and that's where we end the chapter. Sorry. I've just been talking for 30 minutes straight. I need a drink. Bad one now. So there's quite a lot in this chapter, actually. I think some of my complaints from the previous chapter, they carry over into this chapter, and probably are even worse in this chapter, which is the explanations are incredibly convoluted. They are incredibly convoluted and needlessly complicated. You know, and at least from a personal perspective, you know, it feels like it needs you to know all these little things just to make sense of it, and it could just be explained so much more simply. You know, it's the double sevens. The main thing about them, they stop hyperspace travel. Say that they stop hyperspace travel within that set, within those, what was it, 9 million kilometers? Just say that. You don't need to make it more complicated than it is. I think that is probably my main problem with these first two chapters. It's just being needlessly complicated. Now, I also do quite enjoy Luke in this chapter again. I think this is again I think this book is doing quite well with Luke. You know, you see how he's reluctant to be a general. You know, he's reluctant to take part in warfare. He still wants to uphold being a Jedi, which is, you know, taking a more peaceful approach and being a general. You know, he says himself, it's sending people out there to fight it's pretty much, you know, to kill someone to save his own self. You know, it's die or kill out there. And he's unsure about how he feels about that, especially by being a Jedi. And you see how he feels about that as well. And it's a very interesting perspective that I think is something we kind of need to see with this character. And I wouldn't have expected it for some reason I wasn't expecting it. But yeah, that is something that you could see Luke thinking. You know, he is the most hopeful, optimist character in Star Wars, really, and he still also wants to uphold the Jedi as well, but you see how he struggles with that at the moment. You see how he's struggling with that. And you just see how he feels almost defeated by this decision. You know, he doesn't want it to just dictate his life as well, because he knows if he allows this to dictate his life, he may wind up going against everything he's tried to work for. You know, you see how big of a decision this is for Luke. It's not just it's only about him, you know, it's about the well-being of others in his mind, and you see how that is really affecting Luke's decision. You know, he doesn't want to be the one who sends people out to kill or die, you know. And you just know that Luke is going to feel really guilty if he does take it up. For when, as soon as that first battle comes, he'll feel really guilty. And we know he feels really guilty because of the briefing for this chapter, which is pretty much just prologue. It literally is a prologue, just call it what it is. So, yeah, you see how this really affects Luke. And how Luke feels about this. You know, it's something that you see Luke wondering. And the place where we usually would get his guidance, you know, from Obi-Wan, from Yoda, from Anakin, he's not getting any. They're not answering him. He's not getting guidance from him. He has to think back to their teachings. So yeah, I do think maybe that scene though where Luke is deciding feels a bit invasive in the way it's been incorporated, because you know we open up with him in the briefing for the battle, and we're told who's in the scene, how Luke's feeling about this, how he's not necessarily happy about being, how everyone in that room thinks that he knows what he's talking about, even though half the time he doesn't. you know, and that's how we lead into this, and because it takes up so much of the chapter, you know, it takes about probably most of it. It would have been better to you know, have that conversation have that bit be at the very start of the chapter, and then say, and that was all a couple months ago, and now he's here in the in what was it, like the briefing, commanding suite, whatever it was, in the Justice, about to strike that attack on Mindor. You know, it would have been better if that's how we led into this. That way it doesn't feel as invasive, because for about most of that chapter, you know, we cut away to Luke making that decision. I also think this brings up some. I think this is the thing about Mindor so far. It brings up some really interesting stuff, but it's also got a bunch of convoluted things going on. You know, it's half convoluted, half really good and really interesting and really thought-provoking. And I think this is one of these things about Mindor where it has a bunch of great stuff, but also has a bunch of really unnecessarily complicated and tough stuff, and I do hope it gets a little bit less convoluted as we go on. You know, this is for 2 chapters in a row now. We've had really convoluted things, and I was even saying, you know, a bit earlier, it took me a couple minutes to figure out what on earth was being said about the pinpoints, about the 5 pinpoints in the planes forming a triangular formation with another 2 up to 1 on top, 1 on bottom, and it's what are you talking about? You know, it's just a bit. So yeah, it could just be a bit better explained and made a bit less convoluted. I'm interested to see how people think about these explanations, because for me they're really convoluted, but I'm interested to see how other people fared up against these, because I think that is probably the one problem with this book. You know, it starts on one thing. Honestly, I'm the same when I'm talking, you know. I start on one thing, I go on the whole other path, and somehow it winds back on to the first thing I was talking about, you know. Unlike that, but I think with a book, you know, you have that, unlike where you're talking off the top of your head. You know, in the book, you have time to go back and correct it and make things simpler, and I think that's probably, I think that is a bit of less of an excuse to say that you can't, that you can't fix that. Of course, I am a writer. I've been writing a book myself, and I typically haven't gone back to the chapters yet, but that's because I intend to go back later, once I've finished the book, and kind of clean things up and make things a bit more, have a bit more continuity in it. So, you know, just write, because if you don't have anything there to write, because if you don't have anything there to fix, you can't fix it. Simple as that. But yeah, I do think this is a very thought-provoking book, you know, with Luke talking about all the hollow vids, etc., the hollow thrillers, sorry. You know, how people are making stuff about him, and Woods does actually open that thing up of, and how, you know, how both Luke and Han have very different observations on that, and it makes you think about, you know, these TV shows and movies about real people, covering stories of real people, how they feel about this, how those people that are in the stories would feel about that, you know. I mean, I think, you know, with the Titanic, there was quite a few, I think one of the survivors, the last one who passed away, the very last one, I remember her apparently having said that she didn't like movies or entertainment being made about the Titanic, because to her that was a grave site. That was where her father died. And she thinks it's disrespectful to had to make entertainment out of such a tragic event, and it does put things into perspective. I think I'm kind of mixing the thing, you know. I think the thing about Titanic, you know, like the movie Titanic, it's not directly focused on one person per se. It's more focused on like the wreck itself, and of course Jack and Rose. But you know, I think staying from like, kind of talking off a bit here from the book, you know, in that kind of sense. What I'm talking about, what I was just talking about it a moment ago, go on the whole other tangent and it ties back in. But anyway, you know, it's for me, it's in an educational sense. I think stuff, entertainments on, you know, historical things is important in a historical educational sense. Anyway, back to what I was talking about. It does make it quite interesting as to how, you know, how Luke feels on all this entertainment being made, and how it's all, in his mind, it's all rubbish. And, you know, Han's a bit more nonchalant about it, not really that fussed about it, but, you know, it's interesting to see those two different perspectives, and how, you know, how each of them feel. And it does make things quite thought-provoking. And, you know, when they're going over the plan to battle Mindor, you kind of see Luke's contemplation. You know he's not enjoying this. You know he's not enjoying this briefing. You know he feels that, you know, no, at the end, you know, when they have no choice but to push force, you know, he doesn't necessarily want to do that. You know, he wants to do what's best to save lives. But he's got to. That's the only way to stop Shadow Spawn. He has to risk those lives to you know, protect more lives. And it's something that and it's something that he knows he has to do, but he doesn't necessarily want to do it. And you know how Luke's feeling in that moment. And again, it's really interesting and really thought-provoking. And it really, I think just to think about this book is, again, I keep bringing it up, it really makes you think. It really makes you think, but it also gets really convoluted. And again, I brought this up again before, but I think that is probably the main problem with this book. It gets a bit too convoluted in some of the things it's saying. You know, it's like, it's like asking, how does a car get from A to B? You know, simple answer. You put the keys in the hole. You turn the keys. You turn on the engine, and then you're able to drive it with the wheels turning to B. But in this book, you know, it would go into all the specific details in how that engine starts, what that engine causes, what everything, all the very specific things that makes that car move. You know, we don't need to know all that information. All we need to know is that the engine started, off the car goes. You know, that's all we need to know. And that is the thing about the thing about Mindor that I'm fighting at the moment. It gets too convoluted. You don't need to make things more complicated than they are. You know, you're making things needlessly complicated. If you just made it less complicated, it would not be as convoluted. And I think that is probably the one problem I've had with the book so far. And again, I'm only 2 chapters in, but that is the main problem I've had with the book so far. It's just very convoluted. That's just my opinion. You may have different opinions. If you think it wasn't convoluted, that's fine. That's up to you. And I do, but again, also one problem I did have, you know, was Han's line. I brought it up when I was talking about it. You know, he's saying now the princess is too important, and New Republic can't necessarily afford to have a general playing Shafar and got bodyguard. You know, what is that line even talking about? What is Han even saying in that? It's a line that makes no sense in the slightest, and the punctuation does not help. You know, it doesn't make it. It doesn't have that. It's one of those lines where it just makes you go, what? What on earth is this saying? But yeah, and also it is nice to see kind of that pressure Luke feels, and it's not necessarily because he's the youngest in the room, it's because they think he's the wisest in the room. And it's a very interesting thing to flip on its head, you know. You would think that the natural thing in this situation would be, right, Luke is the youngest, and he's really being expected a lot of. That's his pressure. And that's kind, or no, Luke is in that room, and you know he's such a high rank, and feels like he's being expected to have to do a lot, and that's kind of his pressure. But it's kind of that, but not really. it's more in the case of he's got that pressure of assumption. It's not of expectation, it's of assumption. It's of what people think it is, you know, it's not what they're expecting. You know, expecting something isn't the same as thinking that's what it is. That's what assumption is. Assumption is knowing what something is. Expecting is something you think it is, but not necessarily in the way of that's what you know. It makes sense in my head. You know, you're expecting this. You think of something one way, but you're open to the other interpretation that might wind up actually being. You know, it makes sense in my head. In my head. But it's interesting to see how Luke, you know, is under that pressure of being expected to have so much wisdom just because he's a Jedi. And he kind of feels, I guess he feels like he's being defined just by what he is. People think, and it's what at the start of the book, people think they know him, but they don't. It's an image being created for him that he has no control over. And it's really thought-provoking. It's very interesting. And it's something that I'm going to be interested to see how that gets managed throughout the book. So I'm going to be very interested in seeing how that gets managed. So yeah. Also, Han and Leia. They were really funny together. You know, Leia keeps you know, specifically when Han is introducing Luke and Leia. Luke Skywalker Tatooine, this is Princess Leia. The oof of the sharp elbow. I found that funny. And of course, you know, Chewie, given that, saying something along the lines of saying something, and Han saying, "Well, thanks a lot. Luke, don't listen to him. He's never liked officers." And you know that you can very clearly tell that's just an excuse from Han to discredit Chewbacca, not necessarily the truth. You just know that. And it's even funnier because you know, Luke probably understands Chewbacca, I think. Well, he does understand him, doesn't he? So, yeah. But yeah, it's a very thought-provoking chapter, this. There's a lot in this to think about. And it's very interesting. Very interesting. But yeah, I think some of my complaints, again, they still stand. If there are any complaints I have from this, it is unnecessarily complicated and convoluted. And it does feel like it keeps going on tangents that, again, are needlessly complicated. It tries to cram in too much information into an action. You know, in like the first chapter, you know, we were being introduced to Derek Clivian. You know, Derek Hobby Clivian. And in that, you know, we're being introduced to who he is, what his name is, how Hobby is his nickname, and a couple other stuff. And it's put right in the middle of us being told that he's being attacked by a TIE Defender and he's just lost his wing. And it's put right in the middle of that sentence. and it makes it, and you kind of have to cut that bit about that introduction to Clividian to figure out what that sentence is saying, because that introduction to Clividian is it's just put in there as if it's been shoved in there, and it just doesn't. You don't need to put so much information in it. You don't need to put more information than is necessary. And either way, you can just tell us later or tell us before. You know, there is a million different ways of fixing that, of fixing some of these things in the book so far that I could do. I could probably figure out a way to make these less convoluted and less complicated and make more sense than they do. So, you know, but yeah, it is just, as much as I am enjoying it so far, and as much as I am excited to have fit 2 chapters in, because I was really struggling to get one in today, it has its problems, and that's something I've come to realise with these first 2 chapters. The book has its problems, but what book doesn't? What story doesn't? But I think, you know, the problems in this book, they are glaringly obvious. They are glaringly obvious, and that's at least something with Last of the Jedi, where I couldn't say they were glaringly obvious for the most part. And for the most part, my problems with the book were more personal feelings. Here it feels just more like a fact, rather than a personal feeling. I know it is a personal feeling, but here it just feels more facts than personal feeling. You know, it is just really convoluted and really complicated in a needless way. If it feels like it's knots and tangles that you could just untangle and unknot, and it would make more sense. And I think that's the best way I can describe that. You know, but I think this brings an end to this review, and I want to make it clear, just because I've got these complaints, this doesn't mean it's a bad book. I have quite literally said it is thought-provoking and interesting. Which, you know, I would not be saying if it was a bad book. It is a good book so far. I've still got a bunch of the way to go, but, you know, I'm enjoying it. So, yeah. So that brings an end to this review. So, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.